Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the PAASE Fireside Chat, episode 15 on Bakuna and All Matters COVID. I'm Gisela Concepcion, PAASE President, and with me is my co-host, Leo Davico Vic Ilag, who's based in Melbourne. And I'm happy to introduce to you our four distinguished speakers. The format of this chat is informal, and we would like to ask each speaker to speak for about 12 to 15 minutes with or without slides. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A discussion moderated by Vic. So at this point, I will introduce our distinguished guests uh, one after the other so that we will just continue with the discussions, the presentation discussions later. So we have no other than our former Secretary of Health. This is Manolet Dairit, and he was also the former dean, immediate past dean of the Ateneo de Manila School of Medicine. He was also director of the Department of Human Resources for Health in the WHO. And so now we would have linkages with the WHO, and we hope that Manolet can communicate with WHO Philippines, whatever it is that we discuss here. Next, we will have Dr. Vicente uh, Vincent June Belisario. He is the current dean of the UP College of Public Health in Manila. He was a former vice chancellor of R&D in UP Manila, and also former undersecretary of the Department of Health. And then our third speaker is Dr. Edsel Morris Salvania. So many of you read his Facebook posts. Okay, I get them in my Viber chats. And he's the current director of the Institute of Molecular Biology and Biotechnology of the UP Manila National Institute of Health. And he's also an adjunct professor for global health in the University of Pittsburgh. And many of you might know that he is an advisor and a consultant of many bodies in the DOH now handling COVID. Our fourth speaker is Noel Lee Miranda, a DVM. Okay, and well, many of us have worked with Noel for many, many years because he's a very famous vet med practitioner who is an expert on pandemic management. So Noel is senior advisor of the regional and ASEAN regional coordinator for multi-sectoral pandemic preparedness and response, USAID Prepare. And he is ADB regional coordinator for Ebola virus disease then. And he's now scientific advisor of IP Biotech, company that has gotten the EUA for Sinovac and Bharat vaccines. I think Bharat is pending. So with these introductions, I would like to now let former Secretary of Health, Manolet Dairit, give his 12 to 15-minute presentation. Thank you. I'll stop the sharing of my screen now. Yes.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues. Very happy to be here. Giselle, I'll share my screen now.
Yes, please do.
Hang on, I'm trying.
Okay.
Okay. Hang on, let me just enlarge it. Okay. So I thought I'd just begin by warming up the discussion and actually going through a couple of slides on the reported cases. They're saying that we're having a surge. So I'd like to present some data on that so you see where the surge seems to be occurring. And then eventually talk about vaccines and the vaccination program. To preface my remarks, I think we have to say that really COVID, as you all know, has challenged health systems. And this has challenged particularly our health system very, very severely. And 1 year ago, for example, we only had one lab. doing RT-PCR tests, and that was our idea. And we needed to ramp up. Now we have what, over 200 labs? But we needed to ramp up over a course of 3 to 4 months to get the number of RT-PCR tests labs going. The same with the information system. You know, there was no information system when it started. And so the data that I'm going to present to you from our information system that exists today, I would say is really a cause for celebration. And the fact that we can actually drill down and identify cases in municipalities is really, I think, a big deal. But this shows you, for example, the data on a macro level that we have from the regions. Okay, I'm just going to show you the regions. But these are the regions, and I have 2 slides here. These are the regions on the left. Let me just explain what you're seeing here. And maybe Edsel and many of you have seen this if you're really into working with COVID. But for those who are not, these are actually 2-week intervals from present date, okay? Last 14 days, 15 to 28 days, and so on and so forth, up to about 70 days ago. So that's about 10 weeks ago. And you can see here the number of cases 10 weeks ago and the number of cases, 2 weeks ago. And you can see this is the share of the National Capital Region of total cases nationwide, which is 42%. That's actually up from about 25% over the last few months when we had the negative growth. And then this is the percentage growth from the previous 2 weeks, 134. So as you can see, 10 weeks ago, we were averaging in NC, in the whole country, 18,000 cases. Now it's 35,000. And as you can see, the surges are actually occurring, as you can see there from NCR, which is now surging. Central Visayas, you can see 10 weeks ago they had 825 cases, now 5,000. Central Luzon, and of course, Calabarzon. This gives you an idea of what the surge is like on a regional level. And then, of course, you can drill down by province. And for example, in Cebu, in Central Visayas, it's Cebu that's causing a lot of the surge. Let me show you the other regions in the next slide. And you can see you don't have cases being seen here as much. And even if you look at the curves, you don't see any surges there. So the surges are really here in these 3 or 4 regions for now. Now, this leads us to the topic of vaccination. And 1 week ago, we had our first vaccination done. The slides that I'm going to show you were actually shared with me by Boston Consulting Group, which the private sector works with. And in this slide, we're saying that if you look at all of the vaccines that are in the pipeline, we actually have enough. We had Sinovac that already came in, AstraZeneca that's already come in, Pfizer's going to come in. You can see that eventually, over the course of the year, and I'm going to show you in the next slide the timelines there, Sinovac, Gamaleya, Novavax, COVAX, CEPI, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, they're all going to come in over the course of this next 12 months. And this is the way it's going to come in based on this base case, which is being estimated. You can see here, this is COVAX. And in March, we've already seen these number of vaccines come in. Sinovac and AstraZeneca have come in. In April, you're going to see more of these come in. And if you just looked at the totals, of the vaccines that are going to come in. That will give you an idea of how the number, the volume of vaccines that's going to come in. So we are moving from a phase of relative scarcity in vaccine supply to very quickly an abundance of vaccines. The issue now is really the absorptive capacity to get these vaccines into the arms of people. And this, these numbers still do not include this in this list. But as I said in the previous slide, about 70 million are expected. This then gives you scenarios of how are you going to move 70 million vaccines over the course of the next 12 months. And these are two scenarios. And they tell you the shipments that are going to come in the gray line, and the monthly capacity to actually dispose of them. And depending on this scenario of 2 million jobs weekly, okay, that's 2 million every week. This is the inventory that's going to build up for this scenario. 2 million jobs weekly, that's close to 300,000 jobs daily for this first scenario. And it's not enough to be able to address your ramp up of inventory. This is the second scenario, where you ramp up to 3.5 million jobs, almost double this first scenario, and a weekly 3.5 million broken down to 500,000 daily. That's what needs to happen in the vaccination program based on this base case. So if you looked at these scenarios, and if we were able to actually do scenario 3.5, scenario 2, we'd actually be number 3 in our throughput next to US and China in terms of the number of jobs that we will be giving to our population. So that's the goal if we really wanted to aim high. 3.5 million jobs weekly. The question is, can our system be able to do it? This looks at the throughput for that scenario and look at what you need to do every week for every region. That's times 1,000. Every week for every region. Look at the number of required vaccination teams. You need at least 5,500 vaccination teams nationwide. And pushing the numbers, about 52,000 people working here 7 days a week, 5 working days per person, 10% no-show rate, 6 persons per team, and 10% capacity lost due to inefficiencies or volatile demand, people not showing up. And you need this number of administration sites. So this is just to give you the number, the idea of the logistical capacities we have to undertake in order to run this vaccination program. Looking at it in terms of just the manpower in thousands, and this is again a base case. But very quickly, as they computed the number of people to reach 52,000 health workers doing the jobs, they're estimating a gap of half of that. Because only 26,000 people can be mobilized by the public sector. And therefore they're saying, or private sector is actually making a case that government now has to engage the private sector really more vigorously to get the vaccination program underway. You see, our vaccination program has really been based on public sector being the driver, particularly for our immunization programs for children. But that mold is not going to work for COVID-19. We're going to build up the inventory. And mind you, the problem is going to be these vaccines are going to be inspiring on us. This is my last slide. And this is a screenshot of a vaccination report of the National Vaccination Operations Center. This is one of several, slides that they projected, again by region. Look at just big picture. They've master listed 1 million people. They've allocated the number of vaccines for these people. They've listed the number that's been vaccinated. It's 83,000 out of those, that have been master listed. They've shown the coverage over 1 week. Okay, so cause for celebration, we've started, but now we need to ramp up very quickly. Look at the consumption rate after, 1 week plus. We're at 21% consumption rate.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we really need to do a little bit better than that very, very quickly. So that's the challenge for us, the ramp up of our system to run this vaccination campaign. And with that, I thank you all.
Thank you, Manolep. I think that is very, very incisive, very revealing, and valuable information you shared with us. So at this point, we would like to ask Dean June Belisario to speak. And it's after the 4 speakers have shared with us their insights that we will go through the discussion guide that we provided. And Vic will be in charge of guiding the discussion. Dr. Belisario.
Thank you, Giselle. Pleasant morning to all. Can you see my slide, Giselle?
Yes, can you please blow it up to a full, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will not be discussing vaccines and COVID per se. I am not a vaccine expert, nor am I a COVID expert. So allow me, from the point of view of academe, where I am situated now, the College of Public Health, to focus on some reflections on public health in time of COVID. Of course, still quite linked with the vaccination, excuse me, which is the subject of this morning's forum, but focus on 2 major things that we got involved in the past several months, almost a year now. Challenges on data generation and teaching learning. So we are on our 94th year this year, closing in on our centennial, Giselle, close to 100 years now. The oldest public health school in Asia. And of course, just like other UP units, education, training, research, public service as mandates. And of course, public health has potential power, as it helps ensure contributing to a big whole that is ensuring the conditions for population health. And here we are, a lot of us in this forum in academia, having such a huge social responsibility, which is actually, I look at that as power to influence. Now, 4 Ps. I'm a fan of acronyms when I teach. I call them 4 Ps. We can influence policymakers, given the right time and a chance. Service providers, especially the frontliners, the people and the public, shaping how they think, shaping how they respond to public health programs, including vaccination. And of course, partners, not just in the health sector, but for the other interested sectors, because public health is such a huge undertaking. Vaccination per se is not going to be made successful by just the health sector. It has to be a huge collaboration of many players. Health plus sectors, I call them. And of course, in the end, We are one in the goal of ensuring the conditions for population health, including leaking the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to focus on two major initiatives that the College of Public Health, the Simi-Tropmed Regional Center for Public Health, has gotten involved with in the last several months, close to a year, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the major items in the agenda at the start of the pandemic was a call from the WHO Regional Director, Dr. Kasai. Two blocks away, he calls and he says, Dean Belisario, we are in the pandemic and the Department of Health Epidemiology Bureau is highly challenged. And in fact, they have less personnel now because even the staff of the ED, the outbreak investigators themselves were stricken with COVID. It was such a terrible time where the people who were supposed to frontline the outbreak investigation, initially the outbreak investigation, so that turned out to be a big epidemic that is now a pandemic, were the ones stricken with COVID themselves. So they needed some augmentation force. And I said, yes, we can form a team from the UP College of Public Health, faculty and researchers to probably augment. And it turned out to be a more than just augmentation because we were shocked to find out that data were delayed 3-4 weeks. First and foremost, as Manolet mentioned in his talk, initially 1 year ago, just one and only testing center. When I was in the Department of Health, I realized the huge challenge of having reference labs that might help pinpoint the causes of different outbreaks happening at that time. This was in 2014, 2015, up to 2016. And of course, outbreaks had to fall in line because our ATM was so limited with just one reference lab to undertake the investigations in the lab and all that. So I said, there is money in government. Is it time now to set up the RITM Visayas, RITM Mindanao? And of course, that idea was not welcomed by the RITM. It never happened. And so we were forced to actually replicate in terms of having more testing centers to address the COVID pandemic. Now we have many more than just one. So what we envisioned as more and more of these reference labs happening is probably going to take effect. So testing, reporting, processing, and analysis of data all delayed. We were watching the pressers in the afternoons. If you recall, at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., Rosette Verger, who's an MPH graduate of UP, would come out on TV and talk about the number of cases and all that. And in fact, those numbers are actually 3 to 4 weeks late. So you can imagine the COVID, the MERS coronavirus moving as much faster than how the people with the brains were moving. So that's how I imagine it. The virus is moving faster and spreading faster than the detectives and those, the policemen who are supposed to run after them. So, and of course, we know what has happened, so much and spreading to the provinces and all. But the learnings actually tell us that the data, timely as it is, and hopefully a certain level of quality will help us respond and act quickly, as quick as we can. And analysis of data would not be an end in itself, but rather a means to improving response. Available data, incomplete and delayed, may be used as a tool for determining the strengths and weaknesses of the system. And therefore, we saw the huge need, a major gap in the capacities that need to be built, especially out there in the periphery. So when we were in the Department of Health and the WHO country office and department, our DOH colleagues were actually telling us, this is how the contact tracing will happen. This was maybe on the second month of the pandemic. And who's going to do that? And they said these were going to be the CESUs. CESUs are the City Epidemiology Surveillance Units, and the RESUs were the Regional Epidemiology Surveillance Units. And I wondered what kind of background the people had to undertake contact tracing. I said, it's probably going to be a huge challenge because there was lack of capacity out there to frontline outbreak investigation and contact tracing. And fast forward, 2 weeks ago, there's now a request from the WHO Philippines for training of 100 epidemiologists. So, Manolet, and of course, I know the FETP is one of the babies of Manolet when he was in the Department of Health. No? So, of course, the UP College of Public Health is very much willing to help in this regard, but UP College of Public Health will also need help to undertake this huge challenge of training epidemiologists to frontline, data generation, investigations, contact tracing, and all that. Moving on to the next major sharing I wanted to give this morning. Now, we're inspired by our Master of Public Health doctors to the barrios. And very pleased because DTTPs have returned to UP. They started in UP to be trained, but no degree program, just modular courses without a degree program. And of course, the other year, Department of Health decided it is time to bring the MPH DTTB course to UP from the Development Academy of the Philippines. So we have 160 students, young physicians, many fresh graduates, and recruited, supported by the Department of Health, assigned in the underserved areas. And you have the spread across the regions, the provinces, and the municipalities. This is the kind of spread the DTTBs have. You have from far north, close to Apari, to the Visayas, to Mindanao. Our youngest, one of our youngest doctors to the barrios, a UP graduate, is assigned in Tawi-Tawi. So I wanted to get to know him, and he's also assigned to the farthest end, down in Tawi-Tawi. I asked him, Edsel, where are you assigned? Sir, I'm in Tawi-Tawi. Sir, it's closer to Malaysia than the Philippines. Okay. And in fact, he gets the signal of Malaysia more than the signal of the Philippines. So that's the kind of challenge these young doctors have. And of course, inspired by them, we were asked by the British ambassador, Dr. Belisario, Dean Belisario, what is it that we can do together? So we came up with this idea of public health in time of COVID-19 and the new normal, a webinar series, initially just targeting our MPH DTTBs, because we had to continue our coursework. And so we incorporated this in the coursework, that these doctors to the barrios will listen to experts, will listen to WHO, will listen to the Department of Health, experts, practitioners in the NGOs, fellow practitioners like them in the front lines with experience in a lot of these public health challenges. Very, very successful. It's running now in its last 2 runs in March 2021. We're actually doing different public health challenges, not just COVID, because, mind you, public health programs will need to continue to run in spite of COVID out there. The huge challenges related to tuberculosis were in the top 20, Giselle, worldwide for TB. Even as government has invested so much over the last decades, with rising drug-resistant tuberculosis in our midst. The other unfinished business, I call them homework assignments, not yet done, not yet submitted. And we do need to actually help our frontliners and reaching out to them through webinar series via Zoom. British Embassy comes in early February. We need help. We want to set up with the College of Public Health the vaccine deployment clinic sessions. And of course, there were 4 topics that needed to be discussed with UK experts and Philippine experts joining in. Very successful. In all these webinar series offerings, we are able to gather as much as more than 1,000 attendees per webinar. Note that the doctor to the barrio might be opening his computer in front of his staff, composed probably of 8, 10, or 12 people. So you can imagine the numbers that are benefiting from information exchange in this kind of a format. Lastly, and of course, this format can be used as the Philippines prepares for the massive rollout of the vaccines. And of course, challenges raised by Manolet are a major concern. And we're looking for innovation and creativity on how we should be able to catch up as fast as we can and deliver. Just my final reflection, COVID deaths down here and many, many more deaths, much, much more deaths due to, I counted 6 non-communicable diseases, 3, unfinished business of communicable diseases, non-COVID, much more deaths. And therefore, we should not lose track of the other public health concerns, major areas for research and innovation along the lines of the non-communicable diseases. No, and we do need to scale up in a much greater way our NCD programs. No, our NCD programs are somewhat stunted, Giselle. No, it has not grown big, and therefore it has now become a top killer so many times over. The unfinished business of the communicable diseases, you have tuberculosis there still in the top 10, and therefore we must not lose track of the other public health concerns, the major ones in the midst of COVID. Areas for research, innovation, and areas for collaboration. So many need help, but so many also want to help. No? At the start of the pandemic, I felt a sense of overwhelm. My gosh, there's so much to do, so many people asking help and all that. And then I realized so many partners wanted to help. Many of them coming forward, Dean Belisario, what is it that you need? What is it that we can do together? I only cited a few examples today, but many more opportunities exist. No, because there's so much to do as far as public health is concerned, the unfinished business of COVID-19, the vaccination rollout, and the other unfinished business. Thus, the role of experts, leaders, we need to enhance teaching, learning, innovation, in reaching out, information exchange, working towards good public health practice. And of course, as a teacher, I always think now, I'm not very young anymore, Giselle, the success of the student or the mentee is also the success of the teacher mentor. Collaboration needed more than ever. Thank you very much for your kind attention and this opportunity to interact with PAASE. Giselle, over.
Thank you so much, June Bell. You're much younger than me. So I obviously have a great energy, just like Manolet. We're all enthusiastic about wanting to help in this adverse situation, which I would call a medical war. And while it's not a blessing, COVID actually brings majority of us in the scientific community and also the general public at a greater awareness of the medical science that is needed and the public health science and interventions needed to win this medical war. Because as you said, the virus, June Bell, is moving fast and it's smarter than us. It's a very parsimonious enemy, very efficient. And it's like outwitting our brains. So I think if we come together, and it's so nice to recognize that there are 70 participants here today from all over. You are stars that are attracting our guests over to this discussion. I think that we can move ahead. It's very good to know some positives from Manolet and you about the initiatives of the government and the UP College of Public Health, our doctors on the ground to try to stem the spread of this very smart virus. I'd like to recognize the presence of some of PAASE's partners. First of all, the NAST Vice President, none other than Toby Dairit, the brother of Manolet, and their other brother, Francis. They're here. I'd like to recognize Ferds de la Cruz, the president of the UP Diliman EarthD Engineering Research Foundation, a very close partner of PAASE, and many others here. I don't know who Doc Eric is. We have infection control. I wish that you would complete your identities rename yourselves. But there are many here from the private sector as well. And what it's telling us is that we have to really band together as, well, the whole of humanity is doing this now. So thank you so much, June Bell and Manolet. I'll now move on to Edsel Salvania, who many of you know, because I don't know, how many million followers do you have now in your Facebook? Edsel?
I don't know. I think Viber is more popular being shared right now.
All right. I read your posts in my Viber group. So Edsel, it's your turn now. Yes.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Let me just share my slide here. So I have to confess, I originally had 5 slides, but I got slide envy from the other 2 speakers, and they're So Dr. Dairit, I've always admired him ever since he was Secretary of Health, and I've had many interactions with him. And of course, Dean Belisario is my mentor. So even if I didn't proceed completely to public health, it's in my DNA. Very few people know that Dean Belisario sent me into Mindanao to look at I think 100 scrotums looking for lymphatic filariasis when I was a third year medical student, and I've never lived that down. But that's also where the roots of my where the roots of my public health are. Even if I don't have a formal public health degree, you can be sure nakababad talaga ako when you choose Dr. Belisario as your mentor, and I continue to learn a lot from him. So I'm going to jump right in terms of the COVID timeline. It's been a year since we had our lockdowns, but actually this started in January. We had the first 3 Philippine cases, which were all Chinese nationals, if everyone remembers. And we had a dubious distinction of having the first death outside China. But the other cases recovered. They all went back to China. And then we had 2 long incubation periods na walang cases. And even WHO says, looks like the Philippines is controlled. And of course, once you say that, of course, the next cases are going to come. And that's exactly what happened in March. Patient number 4 had travel history to Japan, but patient number 5 was the scariest one because he had no travel history and he had no contact with any known COVID positives. And we knew that this could be second, third generation community transmission. And so at that point, this is where we were. That looks flat, yung March to June, but look at the deaths underneath. That means we weren't testing enough because there really was a curve and we were just not capturing, as Dr. Dairit and Dr. Belisario have already mentioned. Now, I'm part of the technical advisory group. At that time, there were 4 of us, me, Dr. Isa Alejandria, Dr. Ana Onglim, and Dr. Kathy Reyes from Public Health as well. And we had a long debate because we were at 52 cases. Now, the threshold for locking down is when you have sustained community transmission. And that means you can't trace the clusters anymore. At that point, we could still kind of trace the clusters. But we had a long debate in DOH, and he said, what are we going to do? Now, China, Italy, and Spain were already being overwhelmed at that point. And you know that they're very smart. They stick to the definitions of sustained community transmission. And our argument was, we can't use that threshold here. Otherwise, we'll end up like them. We'll end up even worse than them because our healthcare capacity is like maybe 10%. And at that time, the data from WHO with their missions to China were showing that the R0 might be even higher and that only the lockdown worked. And so we were really concerned because we have 10% healthcare capacity of these rich nations and then the high density of people in NCR. And so this is what we wanted to do. While we might not be able to completely suppress, we needed to protect our healthcare system, try to spread out the cases so that we wouldn't be overwhelmed, because we know that while severe cases of COVID will have a mortality rate of maybe 5 to 10%, if you cannot get them into the hospital, all of those severe cases will die. And so that was really why we decided. Now, going back, once we had genomic data from RITM, the big debate was always, was there hidden community transmission from the January cases to the March cases? And the answer seems to be no. These are different introductions. The January cases were all lineage A and lineage B without a number. So those are the original Wuhan cases. And this is data from RITM, and they used Arctic primers and did whole genome sequencing. And then the March cases were actually lineage B6, which means that it came from other places. B6 is from India, Singapore, even the Diamond Princess. These are all related somehow. And maybe the other thing is people keep thinking about waves, but in terms of cases, COVID is not waves. For instance, you have New Zealand, which has a controlled pandemic. They've had more than 200 introductions. So every person who comes in is a potential carrier. And we've had thousands of introductions because we've repatriated more than 1 million OFWs. So just going on with this, in June, this is what caused the surge. Aside from the fact that we opened up, we saw the first B.1 and B.1.1 variants. And why is that important? Because it has the D614G mutation, which was the very first mutation that was shown to increase transmissibility by 3 to 9 times. And this data is actually very good. This is even basic science data where they did pseudotype viruses, they did viral loads. This is already a done deal. This mutation is highly transmissible, makes the virus higher, 3 to 9 times more transmissible. And so that's pretty much what fueled the surge. Aside from the fact that we went to GCQ, nagkasabay pa na pumasok yung more infectious variant. So we got hit with a double whammy. That's why we surged all the way up to 6,000 cases. And of course, now it's kind of deja vu because we're opening up and now these variants are coming. And that's why we're really on edge for this. So reasons for the surge, again, there was no transmission from the January cases, but for March and June and July, these were all separate introductions because March was B6 and then June, July was B.1 and B.1.1, which are the D614G, and more were coming in. Right now, the most common is actually the Hong Kong variant, but there are also many variants present in the Philippines. The Hong Kong variant doesn't seem to be increased transmissibility or deadliness or virus or vaccine in its vaccine escape. So that's okay. And then, of course, now we're starting to see the surge, and we want to think about that. What is causing the surge? Now, we know that the variants are here. South African variant is here, about 2% of cases that we're sequencing. And also, UK variant is about 3%. Now, we know UK variant's about 70% more transmissible, but it's still low, 5%. So yung 95% is being caused by just your regular, old, boring COVID virus. And so what does that mean? People are starting to get complacent again. And that's really a problem because it's been a year and we now have the vaccines, but this is not the time to relax because you really want to give your vaccines when our nuts are low. So the regular virus is still very contagious and we have to go back to basics. So just a very quick, I know you're going to have a variant discussion next week or sometime, but just to remind us, when we're talking about variants, we're actually below the species level. We're even below the strain level because there's the species of SARS-CoV-2 is severe acute respiratory syndrome related coronavirus. And there are 2 strains of this species, and that's SARS-CoV, which causes SARS, and SARS-CoV-2. So there's really only one strain of SARS-CoV-2, and below that are the lineages and the variants. So when you talk about the UK variant is a descendant of the original B.1, which has D614G. So on top of the D614G increased transmission, meron pa siyang 70% on top of that. That's the scary part about it. Kasi di ba B.1.1.7, which means it's the grandson or the granddaughter of B.1, which was the original D614G. And there's also indications that it may have increased mortality. We don't know if this is a function of the increased clustering, but it seems to be real with more and more evidence. Now, just if you want to look at this, you can look at Tango lineages. It has so many names, and we scientists have to get our act together because there's different naming conventions. Right now, for lineages, it's B.1.17, but next strain uses a different naming convention. But it all means the same, and it's not just it has D614G, but it has N501Y, deletion 6970, and a lot of other mutations that make it distinct. We originally reported from PGC returning tourists from Dubai, which, by the way, at that time had not reported a UK variant. So this is the scary thing. This is why we need robust biosurveillance because we cannot ban countries faster than their own biosurveillance unless we have our own. So we actually banned Dubai entries when we detected the UK variant from one of our returning overseas workers. And at that time, they had not detected it in Dubai. So this is why very, very important that you have your own local screening, especially for people coming in. The contacts were isolated. Now we're seeing the South African variant, which is anywhere from 0 to 50% more contagious. But the concern here is really E484K, which is what is considered a vaccine escape mutation. There are other variants, American, Japanese. The more infections, obviously, the higher the risk of mutation. And so the mutations of concern in Cebu, we were able to detect E484K and N501Y in our own specimens. And we were we were concerned about this because there was a surge in Cebu, but the mutations actually don't necessarily mean increased transmission or decreased vaccine efficacy. These are marker mutations, and they probably work within the context of other mutations because other viruses with the same mutations haven't shown increased transmissibility or decreased vaccine efficacy. And this is probably convergent evolution also. That this is probably the final common pathway. The other thing is like in HIV, we see that if there's drug pressure, there's emergence of certain mutations. Like for instance, M184V if you use lamivudine, K103N if you use efavirenz, or K65R if you use tenofovir. So one of the strange theories here is maybe surreptitious hydroxychloroquine use might be driving this in those countries. So we don't know, but that's how you end up with these convergent type of mutations. That's just chismis, by the way. I have no evidence to back that up. But anyway, it may be a natural evolutionary pathway. Now, the mutations of Cebu, we originally said we're not sure if it's a new variant, but it actually got named P3 already in pangolin. And the reason it's P3 is because its descendant, I mean, its ancestor, its immediate ancestor, is actually the Brazilian lineage variant, not the Brazilian variant. Kumbaga, tatay ni P1, tatay ni P2, and now it seems to have emerged independently here in the Philippines, and now it's called P3. But it's unknown if these mutations affect transmission or vaccine efficacy. Because actually, so far, it seems to be tapering off. The number of sequences we're detecting is more or less constant or even going down. And the big thing also here is we are a lot more adherent to public health standards than Brazilians. And so I think that makes a huge difference. So this is the medRxiv. This is in review right now, but we already posted this as a preprint. Hopefully, we've already heard back from the journal. They just want some more modification. So hopefully it will be out soon. So what's the effect of variants on vaccine? And this is really the million-dollar question, billion-dollar question. E484K escape mutation in South African and Brazilian variants seem to show decreased binding with convalescent plasma, but there's not just one antibody that's generated by your vaccines. And on top of that, there's cell-mediated immunity from T cells. And so, time will tell if this is a real effect. But even the Astra data that shows that there was only maybe 10% vaccine efficacy, this is a preprint, in South African variant, was looking at mild and moderate. Nobody got severe disease. So it can continue to work for severe disease. So we just have to take a look at this. So, now shifting gears, the first generation COVID vaccines, these are not intended to give you herd immunity. Everyone seems to be focused on that. They are not intended to give herd immunity. If they do, then great. But the studies are not designed to measure transmission blocking. They are designed to show if it prevents severe disease and clinical disease. Okay, so primary objective, because if the mortality rate of COVID was 0.1%, it would be nothing. It would be just like influenza. No big deal. Lots of people, millions of people will get infected, no one will die. But with a 3% worldwide mortality, that's huge. And so what you're trying to do is transform it into the common cold. And if you're able to do that, you may not eliminate it completely, but your deaths will go down by more than 90%. So the herd immunity is aspirational, and it's unclear if it's achievable, especially with the variants where you're actually now seeing reinfections in some people. Long-term sterilizing immunity needs further study, and those studies are ongoing. They're swabbing people every week. And it seems like for Astra, maybe 2/3 of people are able to resist infection to begin with. So that's a start. But again, this is not sterilizing immunity. Doesn't mean we're going to not going to shoot for that. We are. There's 200 vaccines in preclinical testing, and maybe the live attenuated ones will work because those are by far the most robust, but we'll see. So this is the picture that I want in people's heads. You turn the lion into a kitten. You can try to kill the lion, but that's a lot harder. So if you get kittens, then we're all good. Everybody loves cats. And then, so just the vaccine efficacy, you can see that the severe vaccine efficacy rates are very, very high. Now, for clinical disease, Pfizer and Moderna are great. Astra is about 62%, meaning people will still get colds, but they're not going to die of COVID. And the Sinovac is actually very, very misunderstood because there were three different trials. General population data from Turkey shows that it's 83.5% effective, and this included about 10% healthcare workers. Now, Sinovac was the only one that gambled on a pure frontliner healthcare worker population. And they saw that it was effective to prevent mild disease 50% of the time and 78% moderate and 100% for moderate to severe. The bottom line there is that this data, yes, it's 50%. It's above what WHO is recommending, but we don't have that specific healthcare worker data for all the other vaccines. So you can look at it two ways. There's evidence that it's only 50%, but the other vaccines do not have that data. And we know that the general population data for Sinovac is 83.5%. And you look at the numbers for the other ones. So you have to think about that before you focus on that. And that's why none of the other countries recommended against healthcare workers. It's just us, because we're being very, very conservative. Okay? And just to give you an idea, we're talking about 1 million symptomatic infections here. So these are positive who have at least a cold. If you have no vaccine, all of them will have a cold. 200,000 will need medical attention. 50,000 will end up with severe, and 5,000 will die. For Pfizer, not too many will get a cold. We don't have the moderate data, but for hospitalization, it's still 5,500. Although the real-time data, the real-world data from Pfizer is actually very good from Israel, 98% for severe disease. So this is an exception of, most of the time kasi it's worse in real world. Sa real world, it trumped that. Moderna, same thing, but severe is 0, Astra is 0. Sinovac, even though half of them will get colds, none of them are going to die. Of course, there are confidence intervals. They're at the bottom. But that's what the clinical trial shows. Okay? And these are what the EUAs look like. Moderna doesn't have an EUA yet. The other vaccines don't have EUAs yet. But the three that do, Pfizer, Astra, and Sinovac, you can see that Sinovac has no seniors, no comorbids, meaning dapat healthy, and caution in healthcare workers with direct contact with COVID-19 patients. But, we have a huge shortage. So right now we have about 1 million doses, enough for 500,000 healthcare workers. We have 1.3 million healthcare workers. So we have to use the vaccines on hand. Otherwise, sayang lang. So Sinovac seems to remain effective for the variants. It's a whole inactivated virus. And so there's a lot of targets and becomes effective. Vaccines can be tweaked even if they show decreased. You can add the variants, you can tweak the mRNA, you can do multiple, just like with PCV7, PCV10, PCV13, you can add. So it's not. So Astra had that data of prelim data with less efficacy. Again, that's for mild to moderate, but it seems to still work against severe disease. So I wouldn't throw Astra away either just because we have variants. And again, it's very small. It's less than 5% of our sequences. So the vaccine strategy for detection of South African variants, we have these cases, dumadami na sila. Last week, I think we reported about 58. But again, it's only 5% of sequence samples. And we're doing okay compared to, say, Israel, which reported 1 to 2% 1 month. And then a month later, they had 40% UK variant. And then 1 month later, 80% na. So we're trying to keep it low as much as possible. And Astra and Sinovac will continue to be effective as long as we keep the proportion of variants low. And even if they go up, I'm not too worried because I think they will continue to prevent severe disease. And we need to continue the biosurveillance and start doing immunosurveillance, testing our sera against variants to make sure that it works. So nothing like going out there and getting shot. That's the only way that you can convince people. So I was the number 2 vaccine recipient in the Philippines, legally anyway. Very, very important to say legally. And the number 1 was Dr. Gaspi. So we put our arm where our mouth was and went ahead and took the plunge. And so far I'm still alive. Unfortunately, I still don't know how to speak Chinese. And so I was really hoping that was going to happen, but it didn't. So ganun talaga. So take-home messages, all first-generation vaccines prevent severe disease. And whatever is offered to you, as long as it's within the EUA framework, you're good to go. Inoculate the most at risk and preserve the healthcare system. Continue surveillance for variants, but continue to vaccinate. And as a parting shot, just remember, all pandemics end. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Edsel. I'd like to thank you and all our COVID warriors, Manolet, June Bell, Edsel. And I think you stressed so many important points to our audience. This is a mix. It's a broad mix, Edsel. So I think your fans, your followers are here too. But we have medical, science, non-science, non-medical people who are all interested to hear what our COVID warriors would like to say. And it's almost telling me, Edsel, you must commit to our March 25 or April 1 chat on the COVID variants, together with our heroes who are doing this sequencing in the labs to monitor our variants. It gives us great comfort to know that if the 5% variations are, keep at where they are with our strains, then our vaccines might work. It's good for you to have been the front runner in the Sinovac vaccine. You had this iconic photo with Director Gap Legaspi, FDA Director Eric Domingo, yourself, my niece Mingita Padilla, another COVID warrior, and Vice Chancellor Michael T., all vaccinated in PGH with the Sinovac. And I believe you're all 60 years old and below, but I know Mingita's somewhere there at the, she's like 60 or so. Anyway, so I think it's a good model for all of us. And it's so important to know that our health care leaders and workers are doing their very best to stem the spread of this COVID. There are many issues here I know that would have to be discussed. And we have a discussion guide later that Vic will go through one by one. There are many questions that I myself have. But at this point, Edsel, let's hear it from a guy who many of us have known for many years. This is a doctor of vet med, Noel Miranda, who will tell us what the opportunities are to acquire the COVID vaccine. So Noel? Noel, are you there? All right.
Oh, my mic was off. Am I sharing already? No. This is not, wait.
And while you're trying to share, I'd like to recognize some people. Noel, another partner of the PAASE is Technological Institute of the Philippines. President Beth Halos is here with us today. Thank you for joining us, Beth.
Okay, Giselle, thank you for the introductions. And thank you also for the three gentlemen who I admire personally as well, to have presented on a number of very important points. And Edsel, in fact, did mention about a number of things about the vaccine. And so I tried to avoid that. And also I'd like to just say to this group that I will try to avoid, being commercial in this particular forum, because I think this is highly technical and academic. So I'll focus on key aspects based on my experience with working throughout this time of getting vaccines for the Philippines. Now we understand, I borrowed this slide from WHO, and because I'd like for us to see the options out there, particularly of vaccines with EUA granted to these vaccines. And we know that there are several platforms, and these platforms have been explained by various experts. Sinovac among the inactivated and that is available in the country at the moment, and AZ or AstraZeneca is also now available in the country, and this is a viral vector vaccine. And of course, we are also expecting Moderna, to be coming in as well, and Pfizer, as we better more popularly known, and these are RNA vaccines. And we are, of course, also expecting a subunit vaccine in the form of Novavax and perhaps Zhifei. I think you're not so much familiar with Zhifei, but this is also a potential vaccine that would be in the form of subunits. And there are a number of, I did not mention, by the way, Bharat also. Bharat is also coming in. And as you know, I represent Sinovac and Bharat, uh, you know, deployment or importation and also securing the EUA on behalf of the companies that represent these vaccines. Um, Now, I get a lot of, comments as to people cut corners, animal trials were not done, and these vaccines were rushed. And that to me, is really quite disgusting. I mean, discouraging. I mean, these are actually coming from anti-vaxxers. And so it's for us really to appreciate that there are several reasons why we were able to accelerate development to, in fact, less than a year. Most of these vaccines companies started manufacturing or R&Ds on these vaccines as early as January and February, and going into as soon as the strain was identified. And what is important for us to note is that these processes that are involved in the development of the vaccine actually were overlapping, and to a very big extent of overlap, and which is allowing the vaccine manufacturers to actually come up with these vaccines as soon as possible. But of course, it was costly. It was more costly. And what also was beneficial to us was that money was being infused, funding, government funding, private companies. You can see that. And that was also a very big help. So the global community actually focused their resources in developing these vaccines. And I would say here categorically that animal trials in the form of preclinical research were done on these vaccines. And so, I don't want to talk too much, and I have only 3 slides. So I'd like to get right down to the point of what have we learned, or what have I learned, what I hope we have learned, that in a pandemic, we just have to think pandemic. We cannot think about politics. We cannot think about, personal gains. We are here to think about saving lives, trying to prevent loss of lives. And that's a number one key lesson that is important for us to learn. Number 2 is that vaccine development is actually all about sharing the risk and the benefits. And this is now, this is really in a pandemic, that's what we have to do. And even if it's not a pandemic, for any public health emergency that is infectious, we have to share the risk and the benefits with those that can manufacture the treatment, the cure, or the prevention. We have to remove the divide between public and private sector. I don't know how to do that in the Philippines, and maybe that's also a global challenge, but we have to do that. We have to see that. We have to see a real whole of society approach working. And it's not just a byword, it's not just a buzzword. It's not just political rhetorics. Now, advanced market commitment on vaccines also ensures production viability. So, the vaccine manufacturers are mostly private companies. And if you want to have some kind of commitment, then they are actually being encouraged to produce vaccines. So that advanced market commitment, whether that's in the form of support, of doing clinical trials for these companies, it can be in many forms. So vaccine producers had offered fill and finish arrangements to some countries, including the Philippines, by the way, just to let you know. And fill and finish is actually providing the bulk vaccines, such as what they're doing in Indonesia and also Brazil and some other countries. I believe Thailand is also having this arrangement, and Malaysia. So the Philippines was actually offered this, but well, I wouldn't go into the extent of discussing, how that came about, but to this day, we are still trying to establish at least the fill and finish arrangement. Now, producers also requested for co-funding clinical trials, even just phase 1 and 2. And it turned out that it has to be a private, the private sector had to step in, but we could not really fund phase 3 because phase 3 requires 30,000 participants, for example, and that's going to cost you something like $4 million US dollars or $6 million US dollars in cost of running a phase 3. So we ended up, coming up with a phase 2 and 3 because that's the only kind of level of clinical trial that the private sector can support. So it's really kind of a bridging study for safety and immunogenicity rather than going into efficacy. So efficacy outcomes, as we know, as Edsel also had shown, these are not exactly apple to apple, and it's useless really comparing, oh, this is 50%, this is 60%, this is 80%. What is very important is really what Edsel had mentioned, and I wouldn't repeat that. I think he did an excellent presentation on how we should interpret these efficacy data. Now, EUA, once an EUA is given to a vaccine, we really have to respect that. These national regulatory authorities, they're very strict. Even our FDA, they're very strict, maybe sometimes too strict because of certain restrictions were actually, laid out for Sinovac, for example. But when an EUA is given, particularly by countries with recognized control laboratories as well as national regulatory authorities, recognized by PICS as well as by WHO, we have to respect that. That is actually a seal of, a global seal of approval. And that's what we have at the moment. So we cannot argue against EUAs. And many countries these are multi-countries EUAs being issued. Now, the strategy, of course, as Edsel had mentioned, is really towards preventing the severity of severe disease and hospitalization. So given this current understanding of the efficacies of these vaccines, vaccination should aim for flattening the COVID severity, where it becomes just a mild cold, and therefore we also flatten fear. So flatten severity, you flatten fear, and we live our lives as hopefully as normal as possible. So the Philippines definitely needs to go into manufacturing, and I heard RITM has somehow gotten an ADB grant to go into this. But the issue to us, the big question to the Philippines is this: are we really going to go private or public with vaccine manufacturing? Because while the private sector is being encouraged to start vaccine manufacturing and given some incentives, for example, 15%, kind of allowance for pricing, etc. But the point here is there can only be one. The Philippines is not a big country, and the private sector is not going to invest, on vaccine manufacturing unless there's really some kind of policy that would drive this. A policy that would say, okay, we respect public-private partnership, and we would respect and honor advanced market commitments to private sector produced vaccines. These are the very important issues that we have to overcome as we encourage private sector to come into vaccine manufacturing. So that ends my presentation, Giselle, and I'm happy to entertain questions regarding the vaccines of Sinovac and Bharat Biotech. By the way, just to mention before I end, that Bharat is exactly the same, with the same profile and characteristics as Sinovac. It had just recently published its 81% efficacy. We still have to break that down, but I would say at this point that it pretty much behaves the same as Sinovac. Although the only difference, they're both Vericell, both are inactivated. The slight difference would be their adjuvant, their adjuvants. Now, the adjuvant is important because it can also stimulate, other than stimulating antibody production, it also can stimulate T cell response or T cell immunity. So that's a very important component of the vaccine. So I'll end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noel. Everyone, Noel is always been someone I've admired because of his understanding of the big picture. So he is actually a pandemic expert, and he was in Wuhan and China at the outbreak of the epidemic, of the pandemic, and he was able to come home with his wife. Now, Noel, I think you should not feel embarrassed to talk about Sinovac and Bharat, when in fact Edsel has already also convinced us about how good Sinovac is. And both of you, as well as Manolete and Junbel, have emphasized that the vaccines are there to reduce the severity and deaths of our population, while not effectively addressing viral transmission. There is no data on that at this point. Also, you are restoring confidence in our governments, and including the Philippine government. We are appreciative of what our DOH and our agencies are doing, but we also respect and learn from what the other more advanced or efficient countries are doing, which is to get the EUAs of these vaccines. I think at this point, it's really the humanity of, humankind must come together and try to stop this pandemic. So at this point, you have stopped sharing your screen, and I am now going to come back to the poster of this session, and I will now move to the to the discussion guide, and I'm hoping to scroll down my screen, but on the other hand, let me now turn over the floor to my co-host henceforth, Vic Ilag, and I will now then flash the discussion guide. And Vic will start the discussion going with the questions, and we would ask the speakers to answer them, whoever has an interest to answer the questions we have prepared. So let me start with that, Vic. I can't scroll down, but I will find a way to do it. Okay, just a moment.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Giselle.
Yes.
Yeah. Good day, everyone. Yeah. So I'm zooming from down under.
Yeah.
All right. So I think the first question, I think the topics, I think as it's being laid out or presented by Giselle, I think there's 6 topics. So we'll go through them. I think we have about just over a bit of an hour until I think 11 o'clock there. So the first question I think probably would be addressed to Dr. Belizar and Manolete. So this is from Al Serafika. So do you think beside PPP, can we crowdsource the vaccination support needed for the efficient rollout? Use doctor to barrios, local businesses providing logistics and monetary support, millennials bringing the people to the health centers through Bayanihan. Yeah, please feel free to answer.
Well, actually, maybe if I can start.
Yep.
I think theoretically, Vic, we can. In fact, there are laws on public-private collaboration. I think where it bogs down is the actual implementation. And many of these projects that have actually been put on a PPP platform have actually somehow got derailed. And so it's in the implementation of the laws that are actually been put there to get these things going. So I think it's a crucial issue because now, I work a lot with private sector, and I know because I work with government how they work. There are very many regulations and statutes that are in the laws of the Philippines that actually make it very, very cumbersome to move. And therefore, for example, if you look at the recent law, RA 115251, which is on the vaccination program, you can actually Google it now. And you look at the provisions. The provisions there are premised on you might say, public, a public sector framework. Meaning to say the assumption is this vaccination program is actually essentially going to be driven by public sector. And that, if public sector, let's say local government, wants to deal or contract private sector, then they have to go through these usual regulations. And we know that that just bugs down. And so this public-private divide, you have to think of that across the whole spectrum of managing the pandemic, from the procurement all the way down to the service delivery and everything in between. So private sector can help, they're willing to help, but the frameworks have to be very clear. Like, for example, you can see how these things eventually just get stale. Like private sector says, okay, we're going to help with the vaccination program. But can we, even if the vaccine is free, recoup our service costs? Who's going to pay for the people that are going to vaccinate? Who's going to pay for the syringes and needles? Who's going to pay for the venues in which private sector is going to use to do the vaccination campaign? Government just falls dead in its tracks. It can't go with a policy on that. And therefore, it freezes. That's really what needs to be addressed. You have to break those molds. Otherwise, I can see it happen already because it's happened time and again. The vaccines are going to expire on you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In the measles campaign, they created all of these limitations and said we're going to go with the priority groups, which is actually the approach of government now. We'll go with the priority groups because that's the good optics. But when you look at it from the point of view of getting the job done, which is a mass vaccination campaign, 500,000 vaccinations a day, your priority groups of 10,000 a day, that's recipe for failure. So the policymakers really have to grapple with that and deal with it and remove, the fear that the implementers have because they're going to be sued. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Belisario, would you comment?
Yes, Vic. Just a brief complimentary comment to Manolet's sharing. Yes, I agree that we do not solely depend on the public sector to roll out this massive initiative. Sole dependence on government is not the way to go. And of course, now we've seen it time and again also where when times were better because we had so much funding for public health programs. It's not just vaccines, it's also drugs and medicines like anti-TB drugs, deworming drugs expiring on us. when in fact there's so many people out there that whom we need to save, to serve and to save, actually, is what I call it. And thus, I see a major role of partners. And I had that in my second slide, a major undertaking that is public health, not just for COVID and not just for COVID vaccination, where we need all-out support coming from as many sectors as possible, concerned sectors as possible. Private sector, of course, is a key partner, and may take over in assisting in major ways. No? I'd like to take back my word that private sector must not take over, but must add on to, must assist, complement, because government will come and say it's not your job, it's the job of the public sector to deliver the service, but the private sector has a major role to actually make that successful, to make it happen. And it's not just procurement and rollout. No, there are other aspects of public health service delivery that private sector probably may be better at doing. One particular area, big, for instance, is the area of health communications. There's so much confusion about messages coming out, especially coming from media. Social media also, so much coming in there. There's so much information overload. And there is some general confusion, and people continue to ask questions. Normally, when effective health communications happens, you have less questions because people understand. But when people ask more questions as a result of health communications, maybe we're failing in some respect here and there. And therefore, I'd like to tap health communications experts who probably will need to do a little bit more of health and public health and COVID and vaccination. Because health communications per se in the Philippines, I think the growth has been stunted also. So we need help along the lines of communications, communicating effectively for appropriate response and action. Over to you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks, Dr. June. Yep, so probably try to get Edzel's comment, but I'd like to have a tag along, which is a question from Philip. So as I understand, the priority of vaccination is now focused on frontliners. So does the government already have a plan and schedule for vaccination of the general public? Are there any guidelines for this? So Edsel, yeah, take it away.
Let me answer that question. Basically, it's the NITAG is responsible for that, the National Immunization Technical Advisory Group. As part of the technical advisory group, we actually do advise the NITAG as well. And so I am privy to those discussions. And there is a prioritization framework. So there's A, B, C, and D. So for instance, for frontliners are A1, seniors are A2, those with comorbids are A3, and A4 essential workers. So there is a prioritization framework. General public will I think is about C. Certainly the issue is, so there's scarce resources, and we know that the main effect of the first generation vaccines is still to prevent severe disease. So you really want to do it risk-based depending on who is at highest risk for dying. And so that's the reason why we do those first. The transmission blocking is not something that is already known. We know that there will be decreased transmission just because people who cough and sneeze do have higher rates of transmission. But in terms of interrupting transmission, there may be better vaccines out there, and that's also part of the reason why later on, especially for people who go a lot, the transport workers and everything. And we do find one vaccine is better at transmission blocking. It might actually be a blessing in disguise that they are delayed, because then you can deploy the transmission blocking vaccines against those people. Same with kids. So we know kids are hardly going to die from this. But what you really want for kids is a transmission blocking vaccine, because once they start going back to school, they can bring this home to the elderly people. So these frameworks are there premised on the first generation vaccines. But as we learn more about the vaccines, whether some of them will be transmission blocking, they may actually start to shift. And we may start using two-pronged approaches or multi-pronged approaches depending on vaccine availability as well.
Okay, as a follow-up, Edsel, so do you have, for practical purposes, when the first public will be available for the public, the vaccine?
Yeah, it's just a number. It's just a question of numbers because right now we have a million doses of vaccines, which is enough for 500,000 healthcare workers. We know another 1 million Sinovac is arriving third week of March, so that's another 500,000. Because what we're doing is we're assuring that the second dose is there. So because of the limited supply, we're not we only vaccinate as many people as we have for 2 doses. And
Okay.
so at the end of the third week of March, we'll have enough for a million healthcare workers. That's still not enough. We have 1.3 million healthcare workers. So it's going to be downstream. We're hoping that more vaccines will arrive in April. The other thing is more EUAs are due to come online. So once we have more EUAs, we'll probably have increased supply. So that's Novavax is up next, I think, and also even Gamaleya. And the other thing is keep an eye on the WHO EULs. These are emergency use listings. Because once you have an EUL, the vaccine goes into the COVAX program if it signed up for the COVAX program. So right now, there's only 2 vaccines that have EULs, Pfizer and Astra, and that's why we've gotten we've gotten Astra from the COVAX facility. I have no idea where Pfizer is, but the bottom line is the supply will improve as more vaccines get EUAs. And even better if EULs as well because of the COVAX facility. But again, it's moving targets, but hopefully it'll accelerate pretty soon.
Okay, thanks, Edsel. I'd like to bring in Noel here. I think it's a question from
Yes.
Gertrude.
Oh no.
What health conditions should be looked into before vaccination? And I have a tag along with that so we could cover the anti-vaccination movement, which is actually more on safety as well. So if you could address the question of Gertrude on health conditions and about the safety, the risks
Well,
associated with vaccines.
Vic, I think I'll let the doctors here answer
Ah.
that. But I'd like to respond first to the supply, just to have a good assurance to our community regarding expectations. It really depends on what has been allocated and promised. So the supply is also an issue, not only an issue of volume, but it's also an issue of when, right? When is it going to come? Practically speaking. And so some of these vaccines, for example, are promised to come after July or the third quarter, fourth quarter, things like that. And that has to be considered into how many people would actually be vaccinated from now until June or July. Now, some vaccines are coming in through COVAX. So that's about a number of vaccines, but that's not enough. So I just want to mention that there's also the tripartite procurement that is being worked out through the kind of private sector, LGU and IATF tripartite arrangement. And for Bharat Biotech, for example, we're working on getting vaccines as soon as April and May in the numbers of like 8 million doses. That has not yet been factored in the whole vaccine total that are expected to come in. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So just a follow up. So would any of you, Edsel, Dr. June, and Dr. Manulet, question from Gertrude on the health conditions before vaccination, as well as the associated risk or the adverse events which have been observed so far with vaccines? So at least to quell this anti-vaccination movement or anybody who's trying to spoil the party, so to speak.
All right, I can answer that. In terms of the safety issues for people with comorbid conditions, our recommendation has been to talk to your doctor. The important thing is that even if you have a chronic condition like hypertension or diabetes, as long as it's well controlled, then you can take the vaccine. The only real contraindication to the vaccine is a history of anaphylaxis from any of the vaccine components. Beyond that, even just regular food allergies and stuff, you can take the vaccine. There's just increased precautions. As for anti-vaxxer movements, we've been dealing with this for a long time. They really are a pain. And you also get burnt every time you post on social media. But the bottom line is, if you don't engage them, they'll just run wild and free. It costs a lot of personal time and effort, and you get threatened. But there's no other way to do it. There's a guy named Peter Hotez. He's a hookworm doctor. Dr. Belisario knows him, but he has a he has a child who has autism, and he keeps saying, vaccines did not cause my daughter's autism, and he's been kind of like the poster. He's written books on that, and he's been the poster child for that. And the anti-vaxxer attacks on him are really terrible, including physical attacks and all sorts of fake news. But the healthcare workers, the scientists, we have to stand up to them. This is not the time to shy away from this battle. I know it's pain. I have my own set of trolls, actually. But that also tells me that what I'm doing is actually making an impact, because, if nobody's mad at you, I always say, you must not be doing a very good job.
Okay, yeah. So I just got a note. So it looks like Dr. Edsel and Dr. June have to leave in about 20 minutes. So I'll have to pose any questions to them if we could do that.
Maybe I just
actually,
addressing.
I have a question to make. I'm sorry. I have a question for Edsel.
Sorry, Vic. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things you pointed out, which is a good point, is the vaccines are mainly to prevent death, in essence, right? Severity of the disease. Now, given the time lag of the vaccination of everyone, what is the current protocol? What's the current protocol if somebody's infected, and what should people do so we could reduce transmission?
You mean once they're vaccinated, or
No.
in general?
In general.
In
I
general?
think before the vaccination.
Yeah, I mean, it's the minimum health standards. So you wear the mask, which decreases your risk by 85%. The face shield probably adds a few more percent on top of that. We're probably one of the few countries that use the face shield. But there is a JAMA article that showed that when Indian healthcare workers who were going door to door used face shields on top of face masks, that nobody got sick. And so for us, that was indirect evidence that there's a second layer. Even before people were talking about doubling up on face masks or fitting face masks, this is something that we actually started in the Philippines, at least in public transport, and more in the malls. And it seems to be making a huge difference. It's cutting down the R-naught significantly. The other things, Adam Kucharski, who's a TED fellow of mine, did some modeling about which ones are the most effective in terms of decreasing the risk of transmission. And aside from the masks, face shields, he showed that if you combine household quarantine, meaning if there's a case in the household, you have to take out the index case, the positive case, and then you have to quarantine the entire household. They can't go out for 14 days. That gives you about 60-80% decrease in transmission. Targeted testing will get you at 60%, but random testing, where you just test everybody, the impact on transmission is 5%. So, this idea of random testing everybody without doing anything else is completely crazy, because all it's going to do is give you a false sense of security. Because if your timing for testing is wrong, then you'll get a lot of false negatives, and everybody's going to think that they're free, and then they're being careless. So targeted testing, quarantine, isolation, on top of the minimum health standards, these are the things that control the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Dr. Manolet, you were going to say something. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, thanks, Vic. I'm actually very happy that a lot of these technical issues on the vaccines have been sorted out. Like, for example, the stigma on Sinovac. I think a lot has been done already with the inaugural injections. And of course, Edsel and what PGH has done. But I think really we have to move beyond all of these technical issues being cleared up. The red flag, I think, that's being raised now is really the logistical issues. It's the delivery issues. And I think that's not being addressed enough. Because here, many local governments are not that equipped to do the vaccinations. And we're assuming that they are. And so from what we've seen in the rollout and the tracking of that, there's a lot of work that has to be done. We're like at the stage where we were trying to ramp up testing last year. We're at the stage now where we're trying to ramp up the capacity to actually roll out the vaccination.
Mhm.
The pieces are different. With the testing, we're working with labs and the regulatory issues there and very technical people to run the labs. Here, we're talking about LGUs, and then we're talking maybe even of the private sector networks, if they're going to be allowed to do it, to work with the public sector. As I said, there's a comment here. There's no information on how you can access the vaccines. That's it's a public, a client issue, which means to say the priorities have been laid out. Sure, that's good. But many of the people in the rest of the country don't know how they're going to get vaccinated. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Because, as I said, the vaccines are going to come. And even if, in terms of our target, it's still a short supply, being able to dispose of and use the vaccines effectively are going to be the issue. Like, for example, I'm told that some of the Sinovac stocks have actually an expiry period of about 4 months, not the 6 months that was expected. There's a major crisis there if those vaccines are not used within the next 4 months. And so I think one of the takeaway messages here ought to be working out all of those policies that are going to open up multi-channel, how you're going to vaccinate the public. Given that we're looking at all of the risks and the priorities there, this is a mass vaccination campaign. That's the message. Mm-hmm. I think we're doing it, sorry if I'm very passionate about it. We're doing it by lining up priority groups. I mean, at the start, probably, okay? And I agree, we should vaccinate all of the health workers. But eventually, you have to line up the channels for vaccinating rapidly across large segments of the population. That's my message for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Noel, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add, I want to put also, exactly, I agree with Manolet, and I want to put this in perspective. I'll give you benchmarking. China is expected to vaccinate 500 million people by July. Okay. India is vaccinating 2 million people daily. So that's a kind of benchmark that we have to strive for. Of course, it has to be in perspective and in proportion to what Philippines is targeting, but yeah, we have to ramp it up. I agree with Manila.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Okay, I actually have this follow-up. Actually, it's one of my pet projects with Giselle. Considering that logistics an issue of what do you call this, with vaccination, and I think follow up to Edsel, I think with the quarantine, the masking, social distancing, has the Philippines considered using the practice of using povidone iodine, which is known to knock out the virus like 10,000-fold? And there's a recent clinical study, I'm not sure whether you're familiar, in Bangladesh, where they could reduce RT-PCR positivity within 3 days. Because this would be something it's a bit more, what do you call it, easily done by the public while waiting. I'm not saying that this is going to replace vaccination, but as an alternative while waiting or buying time before you get vaccinated.
Yeah, let me address that. So, these are very intriguing findings when you use something. Actually, the coronavirus is a very fragile virus. You rip off the spike proteins with soap, it dies. It's not a very sturdy virus. Now the biggest problem is really droplet transmission. I mean, if it was topical, if it was on surfaces, that's one thing. But most people get sick when somebody sneezes or coughs in their vicinity or is talking loudly. So even if you eliminate the virus in the throat, there's stuff coming out of the nose, stuff being brought up from the lungs. There's continuous viral replication, and so while there may be a clinical impact on that, the more practical issue is really to keep your mask on and have the other person keep their mask on. If you get stuff on top of that, then fine. But again, the clinical issues here are, it's very difficult to demonstrate decreased risk, or that on top of, if that was the only thing you were doing, then maybe that there would be an impact. But we try to think of this in light of what we are doing. What will be the added benefit of doing that with a face shield and with a face mask on?
No, yeah, if I challenge you, if I may, actually, it's much more effective. I mean, I'm just gonna just run on the numbers. If I get infected by one virus particle through my nasopharyngeal area, within 10 hours, I'll get about 1,000. In the 2 days, assuming only 10% gets successfully reinfecting, you got 1 billion virus particles. So the problem actually is transmission, is you have to knock out the source. Okay, a mask could prevent it. You could double mask, triple mask, but the infected person is gonna shed viruses, probably trillions of viral particles every day. You need to interfere with the replication. And PVP iodine does that, because when you apply nasal swab or through the throat, because once the virus is released from the cells, it spreads, right? So what you have to do is inactivate before it could reinfect again. That's the whole idea of blocking the replication. So if you reduce the viral load from the infected person, that actually could prevent transmission. And that has been done in that study I mentioned. There's about 606 randomized, not randomized, it's randomized but controlled, not placebo. You can't blind it because the other group was using lukewarm water, but they were using 1% eye drops, nasal swab, and gargling every 6 hours. And positivity is reduced 90% within 3 days. So negative for PCR. So this is even much faster than an effect if somebody gets vaccinated. So my point is, I'm not going to say this is an anti-vaccine or replacement, but it's an easier approach that could be used, especially for those who are testing positive. And I was wondering, are there any efforts to reduce the production of viruses in infected person? And the reason I bring it up is, like, dengue is a good example. When you have a dengue outbreak, you prevent transmission by spraying or getting rid of mosquitoes, like standing water, because that's the mode of transmission or replication of the virus. So if you make the analogy, if the way we're doing is just preventing transmission by distancing and masking, if you use that same logic with dengue infection, everybody would be under mosquito net, kulambo, because you're not interfering in that replication process. So I was wondering, are there any efforts to do that? Because it seems to be a simple technique.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, people can use their mouthwashes. There are povidone iodine mouthwashes, but again, there's no systematic way to ensure compliance for that. Is one thing. The second is that again, back of the nares, you're not going to hit that with gargling, with the wash or the nose. I mean, you're not going to squirt stuff up someone's nose, because if they sneeze, that's when the virus comes out. And there is a continuous replication in other places as well. I understand what you're saying in terms of viral particles. I just don't have any good clinical data to back it up.
Oh, I think there are clinical. Yeah, we can forward that to you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Then I probably have a follow-up question. I know you have to leave within 7 minutes, so I just want to make sure everybody gets covered. Questions addressed to you. Oh, I think it's a follow-up again to, where do you call that? A question from Geraldine on the health conditions, because I think one thing, I think from the trials, most of the trials were done with essentially the general population. But we know the high-risk people with diabetes and comorbidities have actually a low immune response. They don't generate as much antibodies. Has this been addressed or further explored from these clinical studies, and what's the approach for those situations?
Well, they've included some of the comorbids as long as it was stable. So that's there. Unstable comorbids, that's a different story. And you don't really want to give it to people who are too immunocompromised because they might not, it's not a safety issue, it's an efficacy issue. They might not generate enough antibodies or enough of an immune response. Those are continuing to be studied right now. Of course, those are all subgroup analyses and they're not as powerful as something that's specifically powered for that. Like, for instance, in Brazil, they looked at healthcare workers. But these are the limitations of our trials, and we will continue to gather real-time data, just like what's happening in the biggest experiment here is actually Israel, where they vaccinated about 70% of their population already. And we continue to see robust data coming out of it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yep. Giselle, you were going to ask something.
Oh, here, yeah. So I just wanted to interject at this point before Edsel and Junbel leave. But I think at this point, we are challenged to try to get our major concerns, broad strokes as well as specifics, to the people who are making the decisions in regard to the vaccine rollout, the distribution, and the jabbing. And the alarm has been sounded by Secretary Manolet, and expiration of the vaccines is a major problem. So at this point, I would like to suggest that Noel, Manolet, hopefully Junbel and Edsel will join us in trying to craft a position paper to submit to the IATF, to the HTAC, to the DOH on what we think are some measures that have to be immediately taken. In the case of Manolet, I know you have now focused on some LGUs where you are going to try to monitor the naive and vaccine-induced immunity, and you just got the permit after so many months, okay, of evaluation by the ethics committee. I understand Senator Gordon and Michael T. had to go through the same for their antigen testing saliva kit, even as you've told us before this official start of our chat, that there's not even any guidelines on saliva testing yet. So I would like to request and challenge Noel, who's so good at writing these two-pagers, position papers, to come up with something that we've all gathered together as most important to address the concerns relating to vaccines and all matters COVID at this point. And we could also try to get support from the other institutions and organizations that are represented in our chat today. And first and foremost, it will be a PAASE bulletin, COVID bulletin. So it's a public document. So I need your reactions on that, Manolet, Junbel, Edsel, and Noel.
Giselle, I agree with you totally. I think there's a process to this, as Edsel knows, and those that are working, with policymakers know. And it's a process where you go through technical levels of discussion, eventually moving to the IATF. And the quicker that process can be done, the better. For example, everybody's trying to do it. Okay, the aviation people that want to open up the flights, education people. So the work has to be done at the technical level to make the justifications very clear. I think we'd have to also be very, very articulate about the policies that we're recommending, maybe even write it out. Because I think government's saturated. So even if they accept it, if the policy text is not there, nobody's going to write it, and it's going to go stale.
So I'm saying, Manolet, Noel is very good at this. So I get a draft from him and you work on it together with Edsel and
Yeah.
Jim Bell.
That's
Okay.
probably the way to go.
So Noel, will you please say yes?
Yes, yes, I agree. I
Okay,
totally
no
agree, and I
choice.
think we can discuss this maybe off this Zoom. But certainly, what I can say here is there is a need for strengthening public-private sector cooperation and mobilization, as well as effort down the ground, up to the barangay, up to the rural areas. You know, we have to reach all fronts. Thank you.
Has to be implementable, even on a small scale first. So, Manolet, you're pointing out the worrisome expiration. Even if the vaccines are here, they're not going to be stored properly. They only have 4 months
Mm.
shelf life, etc. So, I always believe in trying to get things done first on a small scale. Kasi hindi talaga makukuha ng massive. Sabi mo nga kulang na kulang. So in areas where you have some influence or control, maybe you can come up with model processes for those. Okay, so kailangan medyo on the level of implementable or doable. Okay, so that's a big challenge, but I think it should be done at this point.
Yeah, there's one question here from Jonathan Valdopiera. Is there a chance that the vaccines will be made mandatory?
I can answer that. The answer is no. These are all EUAs. So EUAs means that we haven't had at least a year of safety data. And so the reason the EUAs are there is to prevent death and severe disease. And so each consideration, there has to be a consideration, risk-benefit analysis for each person who is taking the vaccine, because the safety data is incomplete. It's okay. It's about 2 months out. There's probably not going to be any kind of huge zombification of the human race in that sense. But again, you cannot make an EUA vaccine mandatory by definition. The other thing I would suggest, aside from writing that concept paper, Ma'am Gisa, is there's a huge vaccine cluster that works on logistics and everything, and to make an even more direct impact beyond writing a policy paper is they always are looking for technical people, and Dr. Belly is on the technical group for CHED and everything. That might be the fastest way to influence the policy, because short of writing the policy and giving it to somebody, the secretariat who may or may not pass it on, I think direct involvement in the processes is probably the fastest way to get things done. And that's why oo na lang ako ng oo every time they put the tag on another. I'm on 6 different committees. I'm on the lab experts panel, I'm on the variants panel, I'm on the NITAG, I'm on the sub PWG for data analytics. We have our own little footprints, because you have to when the best time to strike is when the iron is hot, because nobody wants to mess with the policy once it's already there, because it's a lot of work again. So my suggestion would be, even beyond writing a position paper or anything, is to get involved directly in the PWGs and the sub PWGs. They're always looking for experts. For actually, a lot of UP, Ateneo, Lasal people are in the sub PWGs, and the PWGs is just not being publicized, because some people don't want to be don't want to know that people are working with the government for whatever reason. But the scientists are there, and I urge everyone that if you want to make a direct impact as fast as possible, is to join those PWGs.
Okay, that's good, Edsel. You mean volunteers? You'd have to send your CV to show your area of expertise. But I think what needs to be done at this point, because you've got the broad picture and would know the broad strokes, and then you would have to then try to provide individual stages or steps in the process. I think our bold leaders today, our speakers, should be at the forefront. Okay, and we would volunteer to help with the science of it. So some of us are really interested in the immunology, science of it or the biochemistry of it. I think it's important, Edsel, that you are already in 6 committees. And so you would know from the discussion who are the people who could help you get these things to the vaccine policymakers and who are the appropriate members of the TWGs. But the way it works always, Edsel, is you've got to provide, if you want to make a difference, you need the medium level framework, something that's written up simply and clearly enough. Hindi yung sobrang haba, hindi naman yung sobrang general at ikli, no? So I think please help us in this regard. I would like to also note what Manolet said, that yes, we need to strategize a way of lobbying policymakers on key issues, which we've identified today. And yes, Noel, please be on board and do the draft. And we will meet again, privately. Realistically, we need to deal with the processes that have been put in place by the DOH, technical committees, HTAC, and IATF. Mahabang proseso. So, Edsel, kung naniniwala ka and you have your foot in so many committees, then find a way to, get these things faster to them. I'd like to ask the question of ADE because this is very important, and some of you may have the answers to this. This antibody-dependent enhancement, which is a concern of everyone. Okay, in the Demvaksha situation then, and also now not knowing what's happening or not happening with the COVID variants, the strains and then the variants. What's the likelihood of the COVID, by your projections, by your modeling, becoming stable serotypes, differentiated enough into serotypes, and therefore possibly eliciting what you call antibody-dependent enhancement?
Yeah,
Perhaps
there's no data there's no evidence for that at this point. I mean, this is a respiratory virus, not a flavivirus. And so it's theoretical, could happen, but right now with the vaccines and then the differentiation, even with these variants, that's a theoretical possibility, but it's unlikely.
All right, that's good to know. Very good to know. All right.
So, Giselle, with regard to that, it's actually part of what we call in the risk management plan, which is submitted to FDA. We have to declare what are the missing information. And so ADE is one of the missing information. Of course, it's theoretical, but it's something that we need to continue to monitor, particularly post-EUA or post-marketing, if I may say. What's important, theoretically speaking, we know that ADE is driven by compatibility or ability of the immune system to actually mount neutralizing antibodies versus just binding, or even just versus not having antibodies that are effective. So as much as possible, we want ideally maximize the neutralizing antibodies that are elicited through immunization or vaccination. But because of the developing variants, and of course, we also are aware that vaccination can also drive variants development, because there would be what we call vaccination pressure, which is a genetic pressure on the virus that are circulating. So that's one aspect that we need to see if it's going to happen as we move forward with mass vaccination. Thank
Wonderful. You. I think it's important to point that out, because I think what we would like to know is if there is an effort to monitor the development of neutralizing antibodies after vaccination. I know Manolet is interested in this for his group of LGUs, but would there be a need for testing with N and S proteins, okay, for the presence of neutralizing antibodies?
Yeah.
Anti-S, anti-N.
Just before someone else answers, but we did offer a collaboration to supply the ELISA kit for testing neutralizing antibodies. And this is based on the kit developed by Linfa Wang from the NU Duke University Singapore Duke collaboration. and this is being offered to whoever wants to collaborate with regard to monitoring neutralizing antibodies, and we're open to talking about this. It's non-live, so it doesn't require BSL-3.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to tell you also that there is an offer from Academia Sinica Taiwan for high quality N and S proteins to use in monitoring the development of neutralizing antibodies in immunized individuals. Okay, so
Yeah, but I think Giselle probably
Yeah.
probably more important as well as T cell mediated immunity, because I think there's some papers showing that actually that might be more relevant, which plays an important role, especially for variants. So if you have T cell immunity, I mean,
Yeah.
that should take care of any variants. So.
Yeah, but is that generated, as Edsel said, more with inactivated whole viruses, more than the Moderna and the Pfizer and yeah.
Well, I think there would be parts of the S protein which would be T cell
Well,
epitopes, so that should be okay.
right. Okay, yeah. So that's all. It remains to be seen, right? So there's got to be some monitoring that started. Anyway, so I think at this point, Vic, there are more
Yeah, sure.
questions in the chat.
One more question. Requesting permission to leave. Oh, Dr. Jones has to leave. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I know it's 10
Well,
minutes.
thank you very much for
Thank you very much for this
Thank
chance.
you. And
Okay,
Dr.
thanks,
Edsel, yeah.
Edsel.
Okay, thank you very
Thanks,
much for the.
Yeah.
June.
So make
We'll
a
I'll have to leave as well. So
yeah. So I hope
okay.
Noel, you can come up with a
Well.
draft. We'll just come up with a working group, and then Edsel, please help us, guide us into how to get into the agencies or the task force or the TWGs in vaccine policy, okay, and distribution and all that.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone. And I'm hoping that you will join us, Edsel. I think it's important for people to understand the variants even more. I'm trying to get a chat together of the lead researchers in the lab who are identifying the variants in the Philippines. And of course, we need an MD with them. So I hope, Edsel, you'll join us. If not on the 25th, on April 1, unless nobody wants to meet on April Fool's Day. Okay. But then it is urgent, important stuff. So we'll keep you posted. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we do have, this PAASE announcement page where we have all our events posted with their links. And I'm glad that today I see many more participating whom I personally do not know. And that means that we are reaching a wider audience. I'd like to invite you to our PAASE Friday webinar tomorrow. It's by our De La Salle group team that's going to provide a model for COVID vaccine allocation. Okay, so I think everyone agrees that modeling these days based on some data is a very, very powerful tool. So please join us tomorrow at 8 o'clock. For the De La Salle webinar, the PAASE members, and keep in touch with us and watch our events in PAASE, which are about 2 a week at a minimum. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Giselle. Yeah.
Thank you, Giselle.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.